Good morning, good afternoon, Arami.
Good afternoon, good morning there. How are you?
I'm well, thank you for joining me today. I know that we have a bit of a time difference. You're in Europe, and that's where you're based at this time, correct?
Yes, correct. I am in Basel, Switzerland at the moment.
Right.
Since the pandemic, I couldn't go back to Paraguay.
Of course. So for those who might not be familiar with your work in terms of filmmaking, perhaps we can start there with an introduction.
Sure. Basically, I have directed and co-produced two films. The first is called El Tiempo Nublado. The English title is Cloudy Times. And now, just a few months ago at ITFA in Amsterdam 2020, we released my second film that is called APENAS El Sol in Spanish, translated to English, Nothing But the Sun, that is now showing at Hot Dogs.
Excellent, and congratulations. It's
Thank you very much.
I've been seeing a lot of good feedback about the film. I had the privilege of watching the film as well from the comfort of home. And that's why we're here today, because I think it's important that we talk about Apenas el Sol, or I think it's, what was the English title again?
Nothing But the Sun.
Nothing But the Sun. Once I start the Spanish, it's hard to translate back.
But, I know perfectly what you mean, yeah.
Right? Which I think is also important about the film in the sense of language, right? But we'll get into that in a second. I kind of wanted to start with the beginning. In my research for today, I noticed that you spoke in other venues about doing research first based on an article that you read in Switzerland. Is that right?
Yeah, that is correct. A little bit, the story, long story short, is that I come from Paraguay. The Ayoreo people are originally from the region of Paraguay and Bolivia. And I honestly knew very little about the Ayoreo people until 2013, when I found this news in Switzerland about Ayoreo people living still in the Paraguayan forest without any contact with the Western world. And I was quite surprised, and I was especially surprised about me being Paraguayan and not knowing anything about it. So I started the research, and I realized that many Paraguayans, or probably most Paraguayans, don't really know about this situation. Right. And so it was a good, I think it was a good decision to do a film about it.
Right. And I'm also understanding that you did a bit of research before actually filming with the community, and mainly with Don Mateo, who is our main sort of protagonist. Can you talk about those? I think you said about 3 years of research that you did before you decided, okay, we're ready to film.
Yes, we started the research in 2013, and until 2016, we didn't shoot anything. So this time, these first 3 years were to really try to understand all the complexities of the situation, and also to just be with Mateo and the community to observe, learn, and feel. And then after, in 2016, we shot for the first 12 days. And that gave us a sense of visual language, how we were going to tell the story, and also about logistics and other aspects of the shooting. But the research period didn't really stop there. We continue researching during the whole 2016, 17, and only in 2018 we went to Paraguay with a solid film crew, right, and started shooting for 6 weeks. And then we finished finally the shooting period in 2019. but I must say that the research continued even after the shooting period finished, because during the editing process, it was the first time that we could fully understand what it was said during the shooting period, because it was the first time that we had a proper translation of the whole footage that we recorded in all these years.
That's quite interesting, because it would have, I'm just putting myself in your shoes and your crew, it must be quite an experience to, well, you already know at that point you started filming, you know, Mateo and the community, but just watching and observing, sort of like a fly on the wall, and not really understanding the language, but kind of getting the message. Can you talk about that experience?
Yes. Ayoreo is so different from anything we know. It has nothing to do with Spanish either. Yes. Ayoreo is very different to any language in the world. So we didn't have any idea of what was being said. And because of that, we created some systems. The first one was to have every day, the whole shooting day, constantly with us, a proper Ayoreo translator.
Okay.
And he would use a receiver. He would sit near the shooting place. He would have a receiver, and he would do simultaneous translation on paper. So every time I would cut, I would go to him, I would read, and that would give me an idea of where we were standing. And with this information, I could continue the shooting day. But of course, it wasn't until the editing that we really had every single minute with a very, very precise translation.
Right. Yeah, because it kind of creates, I'm sure that's something you decided in the editing room too, with the pacing, because the language is also very, very deep and thoughtful language. And you kind of match that with the pacing of the film, how you introduce us to Don Mateo and his wife and everyone else in the community.
Yes. I think it's just great that I could meet Mateo. Mateo is just such a great a person for conducting the whole film, and also is so fascinating what he actually does. That is this archive of sound that he has been doing since the 70s. And I was just so touched and so fascinated about this work, and the belief that Mateo has in this mission of archiving and preserving the Ayoreo culture in these tapes.
And I think it speaks widely to a lot of indigenous cultures of oral storytelling traditions, the importance of storytelling, but also the importance of sharing those with the next generation, with the rest of us, so that we know that they exist and they're important traditions that we need to be aware of. Was Mateo really aware, in the sense, when you probably interacted with him, was he aware that in a way what he was doing is activism? That's a personal curiosity of mine.
Yes, he is. He used to be very involved politically. Some years ago, he was the president of the Ayoreo Union in Paraguay. And he's also very vocal in the medias, because one of his goals is to inform people about the existence of the Ayoreo still living without contact with civilization in the forest, and the importance of not getting in contact with these people. So it's a constant work he's doing. He goes to radio stations. He talks to some institutions of the state, of the Paraguayan state. So I think he's very aware that he's also doing an activist work here.
Okay, that's great, because you do get that sense through the film. But I appreciate that you didn't really take us that way. Like, you didn't take us into, all these, the fast pace of being an activist, and you actually stayed with that energy of the community. And I wanted to talk about, I guess, your editing process in that sense of putting together the story that we get to see now.
Right. We had a beautiful editing process with Valeria Raciopi. She's living in Argentina. I went to Argentina and we were working there. Then in the middle of the process, the pandemic happened. I came back to Switzerland. She was in Buenos Aires. We needed to edit through internet. It was a very, very challenging process. But we defined very quickly some things. For example, the film doesn't have situations where you just observe daily life in the communities, and this is a decision. This is an artistic decision, but also kind of a political decision, because we have seen so many times people observing how indigenous people are living, and in almost like it will be a phenomenon,
right?
And this approach is very problematic, because why are we observing them in a special way? Like, what do they eat? How do they cook? Well, they cook as we cook, they eat as we eat, like, to make this difference was for us very, very problematic. And we discovered that it was just so powerful, the content of the stories. The stories themselves were powerful, and heartbreaking and touching. And they were by themselves also telling the complexities of the situations only through the telling of the stories. So we decided to have the main structure of the film on these stories, and you can see that the language, the visual language on these parts are always shoulder camera. And then we have 5 sequences that we call the director's sequences that are less naturalistic. And they are always on tripods, and they are more like a tabloid images. And this is like the complementary language where we can see, for example, the dead animals or the closed gates that don't allow the Ayoreo people to enter the forest, and so on.
Right. And I appreciate that visual language, because I think that added an emotional component to the film as well, at least for me. And I think I've watched a few documentaries in the past few days, and which I love, but this is the one film that I think moved me a lot more. And I'm not sure what the reasons are. It's either the themes, it could be seeing people that look like me, or just noticing that the themes of indigenous people's displacement is so similar across countries and cultures. And I think it's also anger, in the sense of, here we are getting to know this community of wonderful Ayoreo. A lot of them are elders now, and their concern is that their knowledge and history is being lost. And I think that's sort of the emotion that I was feeling watching the film. And I guess each of us will take away what we need from the film. But can you talk about how, after you've seen the completed film, what that was like for you?
The whole process of making the film was very emotional for me. And when we finally had the film, maybe at the first moment, I was maybe too close to it. We were, several months working on it every day for the whole day. But then we went to the sound mix. And it was the first time I sat in a cinema and I could see the final edit with the final sound design. And I just couldn't stop crying. And of course, I was wondering, I was asking myself, am I crying like this only because I know these people personally? Like, is this going to be the reaction of people when they see it? I couldn't know. Right. And I also had this sense of, I was glad that you said it, because I also had this sense of anger, but like a controlled anger. It's like a repressed anger that doesn't really break in the film. And you leave the cinema with this feeling of, you know, like this repression of anger. Yeah. It's interesting because I like I said, that's what my experience was, and I did cry at different points in the film, but I think it's also just because it touched me in different ways. I have elderly grandparents and I love their stories. So that's important, right? Like the idea of having people exchange stories and passing traditions down to us, it's important. So the film talks about, at least to me, it speaks to us about different things with regards to tradition. I wanted to talk about a scene that I found really interesting, and I don't want to give too much about the film away because people should watch it. It's something that you definitely have to experience, but there's a scene, you know, there's a lot of recordings of different people, the shamanists, the songs, the ritual, but the conversation between Mateo and Jose was to me very important. And just the way that transpired was also very important and very emotional to watch. Can you talk about that? Yes. When I did the research, and as you know, I did a lot of research. Jose was not in my research, and it was not in the plan to shoot with Jose. I didn't know who Jose was, actually. Oh, okay. And when we were working with Mateo, because it was always a collaboration, he would tell me what was interesting for him to talk with people, with who he would like to talk. And he came with this idea of confronting Jose. And of course, I couldn't say no. It was so important for Mateo to talk with Jose. And I was so nervous that day. Because I didn't know how that was going to turn out. You know, having this Western mindset that a confrontation of that sort can become very uncomfortable or violent, or maybe that the other person is just not going to answer. And it was for me very touching the way they talked to each other. Even though they could be angry at each other, they had this sense of recognizing each other as victims of the same colonial process, of the same violence. And this is what, even in the differences that they have, they were kind of together as victims. And you can hear in this conversation how Mateo tells how he became an orphan. Right. But at the same time, you can hear how Jose Ikedi was caught when he also was a child, and how he was shown as a you know, in a almost like in a freak show, you know. So there you can also understand the circumstances that Jose was living and why he took some decisions in order to survive. And probably that is the main reason that Jose was helping the missionaries, because that was the only way he could survive. And at the end of the day, I mean, I'm glad you explained this to me too, because I think at the end of the day, it is a survival story. Not just for Mateo, but everyone else in that community that was uprooted from their homeland to a place where they don't have a lot of resources. And I think that brings us, to me, to the interesting title, because it comes from a line that Mateo does say.
about, you know, we have water, but we have to pay for water, even though it runs under our feet. And he's like, at least thankful that nobody's thought of commercializing the sun, right? And I'm not saying it as eloquently as he did, but I think he does give us a lot of really philosophical things to think about.
Absolutely. I think Mateo is a philosopher, and this philosophy also is in constant, is real philosophy, is alive, is in constant movement. When they sit and talk together, they are creating all the time the thoughts, this philosophy of how they are also, is a philosophy also upon survival, as you say. And yeah, I think I was just very touched by that.
Yeah, me too. I appreciate that very much.
Yes.
So I'm mindful of our time. So let's switch to en español.
Bueno, sí, cómo no, cómo no.
Porque soy muy curiosa, quería saber si la comunidad Ayoreo han podido ver el documental o si hay planes de hacerlo.
Sí, no, las comunidades desafortunadamente no vieron todavía la película, pero esto tiene más que ver con una situación de pandemia.
Sí, claro.
Creemos que ya están en una situación vulnerable y llevar un cine móvil a las comunidades en este momento puede ser también llevar el virus y ponerles en riesgo. Entonces decidimos de que vamos a esperar a que la situación esté un poco mejor para hacer esa actividad, pero es una de las prioridades que tenemos al llegar a Paraguay con la película, porque la película no se vio en Paraguay en ningún lugar, es ir primero a las comunidades Ayoreo.
Muy bien. Y yo sé que has tenido muchos éxitos durante todos estos festivales. ¿Y cuáles han sido algunas de las reacciones que te han sorprendido con respecto a los temas que habla este documental?
Creo que lo que más me sorprende, una de las reacciones más sorpresivas para mí es un pensamiento casi generalizado, que sobre todo ocurre en Europa, de pensar que el proceso de que el proceso de colonización fue un evento que ocurrió en la historia hace mucho tiempo y que dejó de ocurrir. Eso me llama mucho la atención, porque nosotros que estamos en o que somos latinoamericanos, sabemos que ese proceso de colonización no terminó nunca.
Claro.
¿Verdad? Entonces, esa diferencia entre creer que es un evento específico o asumir que todavía continúa profundidad en la película sin que la película esté dando detalles tan concretos del contexto.
Muy interesante. El único comentario que voy a hacer al respecto es que las mismas ideas se encuentran aquí en Norteamérica, que supuestamente lo que le pasó a la comunidad indígena fue hace mucho tiempo, porque siguen peleando por ciertos derechos, o sea que eso es una historia universal, ¿verdad?
Sí, yo conozco muy poco, por eso es que no quiero dar una opinión, pero imagino que la lucha sigue teniendo todavía muchos desafíos también en Norteamérica.
Sí, claro, ya sea que empezamos desde el norte hasta el sur, o sea que todas las Américas. Y me imagino que nuestras comunidades o hermanos en África se sienten igual con respecto a colonización que siguen todavía.
Exactamente.
Pasando por allá. Pero bueno, antes de cerrar, quería saber si tienes planes de otro documental o qué viene en el futuro de Arami Ullón.
Sí, hay planes de documentales, hay varias cosas ahora mismo sobre la mesa, es como que estoy abriendo el abanico e investigando diferentes temas para saber con cuál me voy a quedar como tercera película, porque primero que nada tiene que tocarme de una manera personal profunda para que pueda realmente atravesar todo el proceso que significa hacer un documental que me puede llevar años.
Sí.
Entonces realmente tiene que convencerme y tiene que tocarme de una manera personal. Entonces todavía no está decidido cuál exactamente es el siguiente proyecto documental, pero hay varios. Y por otro lado, creo que hay algo muy importante todavía que me queda hacer con esta película, que es justamente que se vea en Paraguay. Que es todavía, no lo logré todavía, es un objetivo y me parece que es uno de los más importantes que tenemos con esta película.
Sí, ojalá sea pronto y tal vez en otros países de Latinoamérica también, porque
Ojalá que sí, ojalá que sí.
sería bonito que se comparta con nuestras comunidades también.
Así mismo, ojalá que sí.
Ojalá. Muchas gracias, Arami.
Muchísimas gracias a ti.